Hey everybody, Mr. Duker back again, and today going over June 6th, right? One of the most important days, not only in American history, but world history. Of course, talking about D-Day, right? The Allied invasion of France. For many people, this is probably one of there's a few, but probably one of the big turning points of World War II. Super important day, and we're going to break it down all right now to see why it's such a big deal, how it came to be, and of course why D-Day still matters today. So, of course, we're talking about World War II, right? And D-Day, when we mention D-Day, D-Day is the name given to the Allied invasion of France. If you remember, early in the war, France falls. Germany actually kind of captures and takes France over. And so for the first couple of years of the war, it's kind of just England and then the Russians and then the Americans fighting Germany. But Germany basically has control over most of Europe. And so D-Day is when the United States and England come back and fight their way back into the European continent. And so that's called D-Day, again, June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious operation in military history. What does that mean, amphibious? Well, I mean, think of like a frog, right? Starts its life in the water, then it grows up as a tadpole, gets some legs, and goes on land, starts hippity hopping over there. Same thing, right? So this is a battle that begins at sea, but ends on land, which is not easy to do. That makes it very tricky. Soldiers don't swim very well, and so you got to not only deliver all the men, but all of their supplies, all of their equipment, all their weapons to across the English Channel to France. It's not easy to do. It makes it very, very tricky, and so D-Day is the largest amphibious operation for that reason. And again, like I said, June 6, 1944. What does the D in D-Day stand for? It stands for Departure Day. So that just is the day we're leaving. There's a lot of D-Days in like military history, but like the D-Day is this D-Day. So like I said, going back real quickly, again, France falls in 1940, and it's taken over by Germany and the Nazis. By 1942, which is what this map is trying to show, you can see Germany has taken over a lot of Europe. And the map doesn't show, but at the bottom, they've actually taken over a lot of the northern coast of Africa too. And Hitler is on his way, I guess, to kind of getting, control over all of Europe. England is kind of fighting by themselves at this time. By 1942, the United States really has just kind of entered the war and is taking baby steps to get involved. Really, most of the fighting at this point in time is between the Soviet Union, right here, right? Yeah, the Soviets and the Germans who are fighting each other. And that battle on what we call the Eastern Front is not going well. The Soviets are hanging on for dear life, taking tremendous losses. The war on the Eastern Front is a whole nother level of brutality. This is basically a war of extermination. Neither side is taking prisoners. There's mass casualties, like the largest battles ever. D-Day is the largest amphibious operation, but like there's even bigger battles than that happening constantly on the Eastern Front. The Soviets are hanging on, but they're not doing well. They need help. Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, is begging, pleading for the Allies to do something just to take some pressure off, because they're fighting Germany, they're fighting basically the entire German army, is what it seems like. And if the Soviet Union falls, then they're going to turn around and throw their whole army against England and the United States. That would not be good. So the whole reason for D-Day, there's many, but the big reason really is to take some pressure off the Soviets, to open up the second front, a second avenue of war against Germany, and then make them divide their attention, so they got to fight on both sides instead of fighting everything against the Soviet Union. So that's what D-Day is. But the thing is this, right? It is complicated. It's not easy just to go and walk across the English Channel. So it takes a lot of preparation. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of training to gear up for this invasion. The Allies know they really get one chance to make this work, And so they got to make sure it is successful, because if D-Day fails, if this battle's a loss, it could take another maybe year or two to plan and do it again. And by that, it may be too little too late. The Soviet Union may not survive. So it's we'll get into the planning here, but it's a pretty big battle too. About 175,000 Allied soldiers fighting at D-Day compared to 105 Axis soldiers. Now, in that number, a lot of those men on the Axis side, weren't Germans. A lot of the German soldiers were fighting the Soviets, and so a lot of the countries they had taken over, they conscripted those men, put them in uniform, and they threw them in France to protect the beaches there. So when I say Axis soldiers, don't just assume they're all German. A lot of them were from other countries as well, and kind of fighting against their best wishes. So to plan, what we did is the United States, when it joins the war after Pearl Harbor, see my other video, the sleeping giant is awake. And so all these American factories that were closed during the Great Depression instantly come back to life and start making weapons, which we can make a lot of in the United States. But it takes time. It takes time to gear those factories up. It takes time to train the American army, because we really weren't prepared to fight the war at this point. And so it takes time. But when we make those weapons, we have to ship them to England. So leading up to D-Day, England becomes a giant fortress, a giant supply depot. It's just being crammed and stocked full of weapons to get ready for this eventual invasion into France. And you can see this photo here. It's just rows and rows and rows of tanks and half-tracks in England, just waiting and being stored for the invasion. So again, any space they had, they were just cramming weapons into England to get ready for this invasion. It's a big one. And so England is just, like I said, stuffed full of weapons. Here's another photo of England. And these are our artillery pieces. Again, as far as you can see. And they just put these anywhere they could find. So in parks, the countryside, outside of town, anywhere there was, let's just, put some weapons in there and build up our strength to get ready for the invasion. So the big question was, where were you going to land the troops? So this is a little zoomed in, but it's a map of England up north, France at the bottom, and the blue, of course, would be the English Channel. There is a small amount of water that separates England from France. And sometimes, well, you can see there, some parts of it is very narrow. There's actually people who swim the English Channel. I couldn't know. You still got to be a good athlete. But it's really not that big of a body of water, but still, soldiers don't swim. And so you're going to have to ship them all across, which makes things way more complicated. The question was then, if this is the map we're dealing with, where is the best place to invade? Now, it was no secret to the Germans that the Allies were eventually going to come back and try and fight their way into France. So they knew an invasion was coming, just as we knew we had to plan for one. The question was where to invade. So I always say, if you were to look at this map and ignore all the arrows and the planes and the units, just look at the map, the geography of the map, right? If you were planning this invasion, where would be the best place to land your troops? If you were going from England to France, where would you land your forces? Well, if you think about it, right, the most obvious place, the easiest place would probably be up here where the channel is the narrowest, right? That's a special part of France, calls it, excuse my French, the Pas de Calais, the Pas de Calais. It's the narrowest part of France. And that's what Germany expected to be invaded, because it would be a lot quicker to send your men across. You could just ferry them back and forth, bring in lots of supplies. Like I said, it's very close, so planes, they could, everything. It's a quicker trip, basically. So, surprise, that's where Germany put most of its forces to build up the defenses in that narrow area, because that's where they expected an invasion to happen. It made the most sense. But that also means that the Allies were to invade, it may be the easiest point, distance-wise, but it also would be the hardest place to land, because that was just a huge, heavily built-up fortress in the Pas de Calais. It would be not suicidal, but very, very difficult to land forces there because of how strong German defenses had become. So instead, the Allies look for an alternate. And as the map shows, they pick a different place, kind of in the middle. This is a place in France called Normandy, which, even though it is a lot farther distance, has some advantages. First of all, it was very lightly defended. There were defenses there that we'll see, but because it was a lot more ocean to cover, I guess, the Germans didn't think it would be a likely landing spot, and so they didn't pay much attention, right? So easier, less defenses makes it easier to attack. It's also a very wide beach, as you can see, right? So that gave more room for the Allies to land their troops, so they weren't bumping into each other, and so they weren't getting in each other's way, because you're going to need a lot of room for the thousands of planes and ships it's going to take to move these men across the channel. So that was an advantage. The Germans didn't really expect it. The beach was very wide, and it kind of gave the Allies a little bit of an element of surprise. So Normandy, for those advantages, those reasons, is going to be where the Allies invade. So now the Allies have picked their spot, they got to start planning for the invasion. But again, a big part of Normandy was it would be a surprise. It would be a secret. So they got to be very, very careful when they're planning, because if the Germans were to figure out what their real intentions were, the whole thing could be a failure. So the Allies are very cagey, very smart in trying to find ways to trick the Germans into thinking the attack was actually happening somewhere else. And a big part of this deception involved this guy right here. This is a very famous American general, a guy named George S. Patton. Patton is one of the few generals the Germans actually respect. He's very aggressive. He's very good at using tanks. He had been training Americans before the war on how to use tanks. He kind of wrote the book for American tank warfare. And before this point, he had given the Germans a hard time fighting in Italy in North Africa. However, by this time, Patton, who's probably one of the better American generals we have, is fired. He's unemployed. He has no job, right? Patton kind of has a temper, and he got himself into some trouble. Now, the story was in Italy, because we're fighting down there as well. He was visiting some troops who were in battle. Patton has a lot of respect, a lot of reverence for his soldiers, and one of his favorite things to do was to go visit wounded soldiers in the hospital. To Patton, these were real heroes who had been wounded fighting the enemy, and some of them gave their lives and, putting everything on the line for their country. And he would love to go and visit the men and talk to them and kind of, raise their spirits, but also it did a lot to help him because Patton, to die in battle was like the greatest honor to him that a soldier could have. So these are like the most honorable men around. And he would give them medals and talk to them and stuff. Anyway, in Italy, he comes across one soldier in bed who has no wounds, doesn't seem to be injured. Patton talks to him and, where'd you take your wounds, son? And the soldier said, it's not a wound, sir. It's my nerves. I can't handle it. I'm too stressed, right? Patton, when he hears this, becomes outraged. What? You're not even wounded? You're not even hurt? Your nerves, right? Here we are surrounded by brave men, some of them who probably aren't going to make it through the night. And here you are hiding because you're too scared and cowardly? Patton literally grabs this guy up from the bed, pulls out his pistol, which he always wore, and threatened to shoot him on the spot, literally kicks him out of the tent and orders him to go back to the front line and to fight and serve like all these other brave guys around here. The doctors who see this are horrified that an American general is around here kicking around sick men. Today, we know that guy was probably suffering from PTSD, right? Post-traumatic stress syndrome. But back then, didn't really quite understand that so much. So this is reported. It's front page news in a lot of newspapers. And the American people don't appreciate Patton, even though he's a good general, kicking around and name calling and calling out young American boys, right? It's not a good look. So Patton is actually demoted, he's fired, and unemployed. So he's looking for a job, he wants to get back into the war. The whole point of the story is he gets involved in this deception. So he gets called to England and say, we have a special job for you. We're planning the invasion of France. You're not doing anything now. How would you like to help us and get back in the fight? Patton agrees. Great. Your job is we're going to put you in charge of a ghost army, an army that doesn't exist, right? We want you to go around England and pretend that you are in command of the D-Day invasion, right? We're going to make up a whole army that doesn't exist and put you in charge of it. We're going to make up a whole bunch of meetings that won't happen, but you're going to go and travel to them, right? You're going to go and give a lot of speeches. We want you to look like you're very busy because there are German spies everywhere, and they will see this. They will hear about it, right? And they're going to find out. They'll put 2 and 2 together. We'll make it very easy for them that, oh, General Patton is in England planning the D-Day invasion, and we'll let it leak out. The invasion is in that narrow point, the Pass de Calais. That will put the fear of God in them. That will get their attention. And so Patton agrees to play along. Doesn't really like this. It's a little demeaning, but he hopes it will put him back in command's good graces, and they'll give him a combat command afterwards. So Patton is, again, given a fake army to plan a fake invasion, and the Germans buy this hook, line, and sinker. So here's a photo of Patton giving a speech to some troops, but again, to an army that doesn't exist, and the Germans would see him, and because they're a little afraid, be very wary of what Patton is planning, but it's all a ruse, it's all fake to try and fake them out. What is this? What does that look like to you? What do you think that is? Well, Mr. Duker, it sure looks like a tank to me. Wrong, it's not. That is not a tank. That is a inflatable balloon. So another part of the deception was to give Patton his army, they created a whole bunch of inflatable tanks that looked just like this, blew them up all over England. And again, German spies are everywhere, or German planes may fly over and take photos. They're going to see from far away, it looks like a tank, right? We're going to put thousands of these up all over England so people will see them, and then at night, we're going to deflate them, move them somewhere else, and blow them up in another farm field, right? So everywhere the Germans look, they're going to see huge fields of tanks, which are really nothing more than these inflatable balloons. Again, it's a way to fake them out. Pretty smart. And when the Germans see these, like, oh my gosh, Patton's got this huge army, which you could probably take out with a slingshot, I guess, right? Because they're inflatable balloons. I always thought they'd make a good bounce house, maybe, but anyway. One last thing the Allies do, remember you get one chance at this, is, as I mentioned, Germany had built its strongest defenses in that narrow part of the channel, the Pass de Calais. And so when the Allies are getting ready to invade, they also were sending airplanes over the channel to take photos of the defenses in France, to drop bombs on the battlefield, to blow up the defenses, and try and prepare things for the invasion. But they knew that Germany was keeping track of these missions, where the bombs are being dropped and how many. They were keeping careful calculation. So to throw them off the scent, what we would do is we would send planes to go bomb the Pass de Calais, right? Basically, the way that I think it worked out, for every one mission that went to Normandy, every one mission that went to the real invasion beach, we sent 2 to go and attack the fake ones. So when the Germans looked at the charts, when they looked at the graphs and the numbers, well, where are the Allies going to invade? Well, if we look at where they put their money where their mouth is, I guess you could say, where they're dropping the bombs, they're dropping twice as many bombs in the narrow part of the channel as opposed to Normandy. So it would make sense if that's where they're putting their efforts, that would be where the invasion is. Plus, we hear that Patton is planning an invasion, and we've seen these huge numbers of tanks he has at his disposal. We're pretty certain when the invasion happens, all signs point to being at the narrow part that passed the Calais. But like I said, for every 2 planes that went, it was only 1 that went to the real target at Normandy to trick Germany and throw them off the scent. This deception works extremely well, as we will see. So, Germany, though, is no slouch, and they're also trying to do their best to prepare for the invasion. And one reason that D-Day is as difficult as it ended up being is because of that guy in the trench coat, a guy named Erwin Rommel. So Rommel is probably one of Germany's better generals as well. He also was highly respected by the Allies, and he is put in charge of defending the beaches in France. And when he is put in charge, he visits Normandy one day and is appalled by the lack of preparations at Normandy Beach, because he realized this was a prime target for invasion, and even though they think they might be invading in the narrow part, there's a good chance they may go to Normandy just because we have done nothing here to stop them. So Rommel very quickly kind of improvises and quickly builds up the German defenses here, and with just simple tools and simple ideas, he turns the beaches of Normandy into a deadly obstacle course. So here he is inspecting some of his ramps. These are just pieces of timber, simple to cut down and arrange at these angles. But one thing we'll see is that Normandy has very high tides, right? The ocean levels rise and fall during the day. So at high tide, the water would actually have all of this covered. This would all be underwater during the high tide at Normandy, so any boats that float over will get stuck on these and get slowed down to kind of be sitting ducks for German artillery and machine guns later on. But at low tide, you could actually walk around the beaches, just like the photo here shows, and inspect and build up all these fortifications. So Rommel is very effective at very cheaply and quickly building up the defenses on Normandy Beach. This is one of the giant pillboxes they had built there as well. These giant concrete bunkers with huge reinforced concrete walls like 15, 20 feet thick with these big artillery pieces. On top of all the cheap fortifications, he was trying to rush and build a lot of more sophisticated and long-lasting defenses. So these big bunkers was a problem. I mean, it doesn't matter if you dropped a bomb square on the middle, they were so heavily defended, it wouldn't even put a dent. So the only way you take these bunkers out is by sending men inside to clear them out. But, this is something else we had to deal with. And the Pas de Calais was full of bunkers that looked just like this. There was a few at Normandy, but they were rushing to get them built. There weren't as many built as Rommel was hoping when the invasion began. Here's a photo of high tide again with some obstacles here on the beaches. You can see some of the cliff sides in the back where they would put in some machine gun bunkers and spotters. But just to show the tide here, at low tide, this would all be exposed. You could just walk past those obstacles. The beaches at Normandy, the water level is a big thing. Is there something else? Oh man, I'm missing something. So I apologize. Besides this, you can see some of the obstacles here. So these are just basically railroad track that Rommel had cut into pieces and then welded together to look like a jack, like a jumping jack, right? And so any boats that went over this, same thing, they'll get stuck. The edges were sharp and they could rip the bottom of a boat out and sink your boat. There were landmines also buried in the sand under the water. So any men that walked around the shore could get blown up by landmines. Sometimes he just took a landmine, stuck it on a 2x4 and put that in the water. So when the water level was high, you would have a landmine right below the water. And then at low tide, men would have to run around landmines at head level, which is a little unnerving. There were rows of barbed wire right past this. The men would have to try and get across as well. And off the picture, like I said, there in the hills by the beaches would be a lot of machine gun nests, bunkers, snipers, and heavy artillery pieces that would be shooting at and unfortunately blowing up the men trying to come across the beach. This was one big, giant, deadly obstacle course with just simple tools, 2x4s, landmines, railroad track, trees, that Rommel turned into a fortress, a meat grinder is basically what it was. So Germany is prepared for the invasion as well. When the invasion actually began, the plans had called for 5 invasion beaches. Each beach was given a code name: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Gold and Sword were English beaches. Juno, I believe, was Canada. Go Canada. They participated as well. Utah and Omaha were the code names for the American beaches. So the idea was to kind of divide and conquer. Take this really big, wide beach and let's separate it into 5 smaller ones. Once we conquer each small beach, we can link them together, make a giant beachhead, which is big and wide, and then we can just start shoveling equipment from England onto the shores of Normandy. All the tanks and guns and fuel and ammo and medicine and food and trucks we've been building up, just dump them on the beach as fast as we can and start pushing into France. So that was the plan. However, of all the beaches, most of them actually were captured fairly easily. On some beaches, the guys just walked off the boats carrying bicycles with them. But of all the beaches, the one that we remember the most is Omaha Beach, because that is the one beach where everything went wrong and they had the highest number of casualties. So who's in charge of this? It's the guy in the cap to the left, pointing his finger, a guy named Dwight D. Eisenhower. So Eisenhower is an American general, future president of the United States, but not there yet. He was put in charge of the Allied invasion, and so he was the one who was planning all these attacks and deceptions and all of that. So here he is with some of his generals, I think the eve of D-Day, just going over the troops one more time and getting ready for the attack. So before any ships actually went to D-Day, the plan called to send a bunch of soldiers, paratroopers, over at night. So you got about 23,500 paratroopers in the middle of the night, would fly over the channel kind of in secret, and these guys would parachute out of their airplanes behind the beaches to basically raise hell and cause as much trouble as they could. Germany had a lot of tanks just behind the beach because they weren't sure where the invasion was going to be. So their plan was just kind of wait until the Allies played their cards. And then when the invasion happened, to rush these tanks down onto the beach and wipe the Americans off. And well, tanks are hard to fight. So the paratroopers' job was to slow those tanks down, cause chaos and confusion, and basically buy time for us to get all the men on the beach before those tanks come and just wipe them off the field. Transport planes and gliders were used. We don't use gliders now, but think you can't really parachute a Jeep at this time onto the battlefield. You can't parachute artillery or supplies. And so what they used to do is have these giant gliders, planes with no engines basically, that were towed like a tow truck behind a cargo plane. And these gliders, you would cut the cord and like a paper airplane would just kind of slowly, they had a pilot, but slide and glide onto the ground, hopefully make a successful crash landing. And then you could just drive your Jeep off these transports, these gliders. You could carry a lot of weapons and supplies that way. Very dangerous, but we didn't have helicopters at the time, which we would use for that now. But they actually had guys in basically these giant gliders gliding in silent onto France. Now, the paratroopers, like I said, were expected to blow up bridges, disrupt communications, and to slow the German tanks down and just cause confusion. They were expected to take heavy losses, and they did. Many of these guys never made it to France. They were just simply shot out of the sky by German anti-aircraft fire in their planes before they jumped. Many of them were shot parachuting down. Many of them got stuck from their parachutes onto buildings or trees where they couldn't get down, and the Germans would just find them and shoot them as they hung. A lot of the men ended up drowning, actually, because they jumped too early and landed into the English Channel, or they unfortunately fell into flooded farm fields. So one of Germany's plans was, when the invasion began, to blow up all the dams in the French farm fields by Normandy and flooding the farm fields, not with a lot of water, but the irrigation that they would use for farming. These paratroopers had to carry all their equipment with them into battle. You just can't go back to base and resupply when you're behind enemy lines. So these guys had over 100 pounds of gear on them. They were, all their food, ammo, medicine they needed. And these guys, unfortunately, if you landed on your back, if you landed on your stomach, if you didn't have someone to help you take off your parachute and your gear, you were kind of stuck. And unfortunately, many of these guys, that's what happened to them. They landed in these flooded fields on their backs and ended up drowning in like 6 inches of water just because they didn't have the strength to just get up. And many of the men ended up dying that way as well, which is incredibly sad. However, the paratroopers did do their job, caused a lot of confusion. They also got scattered. Nobody landed where they were supposed to. All the paratroopers had specific missions and locations they were supposed to carry out. But it was a happy accident, I guess, because everyone just landed everywhere. When the Germans tried to fight back, they had no idea what was going on. Everywhere they turned, there was paratroopers hiding in the bushes because there was literally paratroopers hiding in like all the bushes because they were just scattered and they had no idea where they were. But it actually was probably more effective that they were all spread out and lost because the Germans just had no idea where they were hiding and how many there were, and just made everything more confused. The paratroopers were confused. Hell, the Germans were super confused because of that, right? As soon as the first morning light hit, then the soldiers for the invasion got onto boats, like you can see here, and they're just kind of like open roof speedboats, and started heading towards the beaches. But a lot of these men had been waiting. It takes time to get into these boats, so they were cold, tired, wet, and seasick, waiting for hours to get started. But finally, when the light hit, they started heading towards the beaches. And here you can see some guys from D-Day heading towards the beach. 4,000 transports, 800 warships. This was a huge armada. Every ship you could get, you needed for the invasion. So like I said, most of the troops landed fairly easily. As they were heading towards the beach, you had a lot of big battleships behind them shooting their cannons as artillery and trying to blow up the Germans on the beaches. So when the troops hit, everything would have been blown up. The artillery was to make shell holes, big craters in the sand for cover, because there's not a lot of places to hide on the beach. So these men could hide in these shell holes for cover, blow up the German pillboxes, machine guns, and traps, and make it easy. And in most of the beaches, that is what happened, and that is what worked. Not at Omaha Beach. That morning, Omaha had a very heavy fog over it. So the battleships couldn't see their targets. And so when they fired their shells, they missed. The shells went too far inland, didn't hit any of the targets. And so what happened is when the men landed at Omaha, Omaha was at 100%. Not anything had been hit. And those men were being dropped off into German defenses at full strength and took heavy casualties. It didn't help that Omaha was also the widest of the 5 beaches. And so they knew that that would be the hardest to take because the Germans had the most defenses built there. It was the most heavily built up and defended. I'm not lying. As you can see there, 8 concrete bunkers, 35 machine gun pillboxes, 4 artillery batteries, 18 anti-tank guns, 35 rocket launchers, 85 machine guns. It was swarming with defensive structures, and that's, again, what the men had to fight through at Omaha Beach, and they took heavy, heavy losses. That photograph there is from a movie, maybe you heard of it, called Saving Private Ryan. Not a lot of photos of Omaha Beach, as we'll see, but this movie does a pretty good job of kind of accurately showing what it would have looked like, and it was just chaos on Omaha Beach. Just like the paratroopers, these guys got scattered as well. A lot of the boats missed their target because the ocean drift, the current pushed them away. So the paratroopers, the soldiers didn't also land where they were expected to. Many of them never made it to the beach because they were blown up on the ship. Many of them had to get dropped off early because their boats got stuck. And same thing, these guys had a lot of gear. As soon as they got off that boat, their head goes underwater and they ended up drowning because they couldn't take off their equipment quick enough and never made it to the beach. Or, a lot of the guys just got shot trying to swim and wade to the sand and never made it there. Once they got there, there was nowhere to go. And so the men had to hide behind these defenses, which were designed to kill them. It was the only cover they had, and they got stuck. Basically, that's as far as they got. They couldn't push up any farther. They were taking too many casualties, and the boats just kept coming back, sending wave after wave, just more men onto the beach, basically to get stuck and die on the sand. It got really bad. Eventually, there was talk that they might have to abandon Omaha Beach because after a couple hours, the men still hadn't gotten past this point. And there was no point to send men further just to die on the beach. They were considering seriously giving up on Omaha. They'd have to strand the men there, but just kind of give up on that beach and move on. Eventually, small groups of men got together. They were able to fight their way up the beach. These are people, they didn't know each other. They never trained together. They're all from different units. But, hey, we can die here, or we can die up there and take some of these guys out with us. So these men got in small groups. They started to fight their way up to up the hills and the sandy cliffs and clear out those defenses. And one by one, they slowly thinned the Germans out and cleared the beach. But, they're running through artillery, through machine gun, through landmines. They brought some of the battleships up basically to the sand where they were going to get stuck so they could start blasting these German defenses point blank range. Basically, desperate times call for desperate measures. But it worked, and these guys fought their way up Omaha Beach. Now, this is a real photograph from Omaha. The reason we don't have many real photos from Omaha is the Army would send combat photographers, that was a thing, it still is today, to document and take pictures of the exploits that the units would do in combat for the history of the Army. It just so happens, though, that one of the photographers from D-Day took photographs, and he survived, but when he came back to expose the photos, they all got ruined in the darkroom. I don't know if someone opened the door when he was trying to do the negatives, or maybe water got in the camera, or something happened, but a lot of the photos were ruined afterwards, and they were lost forever. But a few survived, and so this is one of them. And you can see the men are charging up the beach here. onto Omaha. The tide is kind of coming in. The obstacles are kind of partially submerged. Again, at full tide, they would be fully covered by water. So the tide is starting to recede a little bit. It is very foggy. It is very smoky from all the shooting that's going on. You can see some men have been hit already. You had orders to leave them alone, right? If you stopped to try and rescue somebody, you made yourself a target. So you just had to ignore those guys and keep going. As the tide rose, a lot of these guys ended up drowning because, again, they couldn't move, they couldn't get help, and the water came over their heads, and they ended up drowning that way. If you look in the distance, you can see some of the hills in the very, very back, which is where all the German positions would be. And there are some foggy things here. I'm not sure if those were tanks or just more German obstacles. They actually found a way to float tanks like a ship and send these little, they call them DD tanks, onto the beach. Many of them didn't make it. They ended up sinking in the ocean, but a few did, and I'm not sure if those were some of those tanks or not. It's hard to tell. This is also another photo from D-Day, so you can see a guy in the water. I don't think he has ever been identified. I don't think anyone knows who this guy is, but you can see, again, some of the obstacles in the back and some of the men, a little blurry, but trying to hide behind the obstacles. You can see loose gear or abandoned gear is floating in the water. The water, I guess, was turning red, survivors said, because of how much blood from the men being killed on the beaches there. Not a good place to be, but that is another actual photograph from Omaha Beach. So eventually, like I said, the men from Omaha came up, cleared the beach out. By the afternoon, all the beaches had been captured, and the Allies were then able to link them together. And you can see here now that the danger is gone, you could just drive your giant transport ships right up to the beach, drop the drawbridge, and just start driving tanks and trucks right out onto the sand and start pouring equipment into Normandy. And so Normandy becomes kind of like a giant truck stop, right? For the next couple weeks and months, probably actually the rest of the war, we were just driving ships up to the beaches, driving the weapons right off of them, and that's how we got our army into France to try and fight back against Germany, right? The Germans, what happened with them, never really were able to fight back because they never really believed Normandy was the real invasion. The deception worked so well that Hitler himself, I think it was 2 or 3 days after D-Day before Hitler finally ordered his soldiers to go and counterattack, because he was convinced that Normandy was a distraction and the real invasion was still going to happen at the narrow part of the channel past the Calais. So for, I think, 2 or 3 crucial days, the Germans really could have tried to resist and fight back, but Hitler ordered his men to stay put and to wait, because he was sure this was just a deception and the real invasion was going to happen anytime now in the narrow part of the channel. He was convinced that's how good Allied deception had worked. Of course, that never happened. Eventually, had to kind of swallow his pride and realize, this is the real invasion. And it's already too late because they've already poured enough equipment in there. Oops, my bad. Yeah, Germany never really was able to counterattack. We'll skip this here. It's just a secondary way they were trying to drop off equipment. A lot of cool stuff they invented for this invasion. But just to finish up here. So again, why is this important? Again, D-Day is the first step back towards Europe. And once we liberate Normandy, and then soon we liberate Paris, and soon we liberate France, very quickly the war is going to be over. In less than 10 months, Hitler will be dead, Germany will have surrendered, and the war in Europe will be over. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Doesn't mean it's a cakewalk. but it is the beginning of the end. That's why we like to say it's the turning point of World War II. It does take a lot of pressure off the Soviets. Now they're able to advance into Germany, and we're able to advance from the Western. So Germany's kind of being attacked now from both sides, and it just kind of quickly, I don't want to say snowballs, but it builds and builds and builds. And afterwards, it's pretty apparent, the Allies are going to win this war. It's just how long is it going to take, and how long is Germany going to keep fighting for? But in less than a year, the war will be over because of D-Day, right? One last picture here. This is a photo of the D-Day National Cemetery in Normandy, France. Unfortunately, many Americans never made it back home. They're still in France today. And so this is the cemetery for all the men who died fighting to free France June 6th, D-Day in Normandy. And so you can see, again, it's just rows and rows of Americans on French soil. And I've never been there, but it's a place I definitely would like to go and visit one day. And it was with great cost. As you can see, those beaches, that's a great cost it took to try and secure and capture those beaches. So that is it. So, okay. So hopefully it was long, but hopefully that was super simplified and easy to understand. And maybe you have a better grasp now of what D-Day is and why it's a big deal and how it was planned and its impact and effect on World War II. So thanks for watching and making it this far. Again, I'm Mr. Duker, Super Simplified Social Studies, and I'll catch you later. Have a good day. All right.